Hello and welcome to Beecraft Live. I'm Rodri and I'm back from my little month's break that I had last month. Tonight we've got a special microscopy event. We've got Bob Mora from Beecraft and we have Stephen as well, one of our regular contributors. Would you like to give a little introduction about yourself, Bob, for the participants who might not know you?
Sure. Thanks, Rodri. Well, I'm director of Beecraft, amongst many other things. I'm also chair of Surrey Beekeepers Association and chair of the National Honey Show. And I do quite a bit of examining for the British Beekeepers Association. So, and in my spare time, I look at my own bees. Excuse me?
Oh, I think that was a little bit of feedback then, interrupting you. Sorry.
Yes, that was my fault, Bob. Sorry about that. That was a bit of feedback indeed from my phone.
No problem. Did you get all that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, no, that was brilliant. As you can see tonight, we've got a few gremlins. Beecraft have got a new website which went live a few days ago, so we are struggling at the moment to access some of the questions which are coming through via the website. So what we'd suggest, if following Bob's presentation, if you have any questions to answer, if you could ask them via Facebook or Twitter. Stephen is monitoring that at the moment and we can pick them up as we go. So, should we get started, Bob? Because we've got quite a lot to cover this evening. So
let's just put the first slide up, and I should explain that I don't consider myself to be an expert in microscopy. I'm just an enthusiastic amateur. So I won't be making a really technical presentation tonight. I just want to sort of get those of you who are thinking about microscopy to realize that you don't have to worry too much about the technicalities and you can have a lot of fun quite easily. Some years ago, Beecraft asked me to write a little pamphlet. You may have seen the excellent little booklets that Beecraft have on all manner of subjects, and they asked me to do a microscopy version. And I quite quickly realized that actually there was a lot of information, and so it turned from a booklet into a full-sized book. So I'm a kind of an accidental author, if you like. What we're going to do, I'm going to ask Rodri to advance the slides each time, so you'll have to excuse me with a rather large number of next slides. So let's go with the first slide, Rodri, and we'll go straight off at a complete tangent and look at nice cars. It doesn't take much to make me look at nice cars. So we've got a nice Ferrari here. Next slide, Rodri. And another fine piece of Italian design. This is actually, it's a Giugiaro design. It's quite sought after these days. Next slide, please. The point of showing them to you is just to make the point that they may be at very different ends of the spectrum, but at the end of the day, they both do the same job. They'll both get you from A to B. So next slide, please. It's the same thing with microscopes. On the right, it's a very, very basic little low-powered microscope, which would probably cost you about 70 quid. The one on the left is also a low-powered magnification microscope, but it's got some serious optics in it, and that's probably, I don't know what that would cost now, but I'm guessing £5,000, something in that area. Other thing to think about also, just before we stray right away from the car analogies, is that with any car, you can drive it to the shops without knowing what its compression ratios are and the firing order of the pistons. You don't need to know that. And it's the same with microscopes. You don't need to know all the techie details at the start. If you want to get into that later, well, that's fine. But I just want to try and demystify things as much as possible. So next slide, please. First question, do you need a microscope? Well, next slide. You can have a lot of fun just with a hand lens. I carry one of these all my life. I was a jeweler by trade, so I know, I've always used these, and I, to this day, usually have one in my pocket. Don't be seduced by the higher magnifications there. Higher magnification isn't always better. They're harder to hold still, and you see such a small area that it's not often as useful as going for something simple. So for me, I'd go for the top right hand side there, that little 10 times lens. Ever so much you can do. You can have that at the hive side, and you can pull out the ventriculus of a bee, look at its gut, see if it's discolored, and see if there might be any disease there. And it's quite fun. Just stick it in your pocket when you're walking the dog and look at things. It's amazing what you can see. Next slide, please. So just whilst we're on it, that's how to hold a hand lens. Don't hold it away from you, or you'll never see anything. Brace it against your eyebrow and bring the subject up, and it'll focus about an inch or so from the lens. And you can spend a couple of quid on a hand lens or a lot of money. A cheap one for maybe a tenner or so, you'll have a lot of fun with. You don't really need to spend a lot of money. It's the more money you spend, the better the optics are. Really, as simple as that. Okay, so next slide. I'm assuming that you're here tonight because you do want a microscope. So it begs the question, how do you choose one? Next slide. And the bad news is that really you need two. Next slide. There are two very different types of microscope, and we'll talk about both of those tonight. The one on the left is a low power microscope for dissection, and the compound one on the right is much higher magnifications for seeing much smaller things. So let's start with the dissecting microscope. Next slide, please, Rodri. So here we've got a low power dissecting microscope. So it's typically used for anatomical dissections. As you can see, it's binocular. Usually they have eyepieces with a 10 times magnification, and then the lens looking down at the subject, we call it the objective lens. That's the little rectangular black box that you can see in this case. That will have quite a low magnification. It might be, say, 1 or 2 times. And the way you work out how much magnification you're going to get is to multiply the objective by the eyepiece. So if you've got a 10 times eyepiece and a 2 times objective, you're going to have 20 times magnification. And for most dissection, that's really all you need. There are 2 important things to understand about this type of microscope. One is that the little box with the objective lens is actually not 1 lens, but 2 lenses. And so there are 2 completely separate light paths going up to the eyepieces. So just like you and I can see in stereo, this is a proper stereo vision. The other important thing to remember is that you'll see behind the objective lens is a little white box with a cable running up to it, and that's a little lamp. So the light comes down from that and is reflected off the surface, off the subject, and bounces back up into the objective lens. The one you're looking at there also has, you can see, a frosted disc, and there is a light underneath there which you can turn on. Quite honestly, for most beekeeping, that isn't really very useful. So most beekeepers with this type of microscope replace that frosted disc with just an opaque white one. Okay, next slide, please. The little, let's just talk about a little bit about how these work. The focusing is very crude on these. You just, to start with, slide the entire unit up and down the post on the stand, and once you get it more or less right, you fine tune it with the little knob that you can see where there's a ratchet. Okay, next slide. Now, the little lamp that you saw is okay, but you will get far, far better results, and you'll see much better if you have some extra lighting. Now, fiber optic lighting is the Rolls-Royce solution, and lamps like these are lovely, but very expensive. You're into 3 figures here. So what I would thoroughly recommend is a trip to IKEA, and after you've had your meatballs, go and buy, they have a little gooseneck lamp with an LED light in it, which is brilliant, and it's a tenner. So I'd push the boat out and buy 2 of them, and have one either side of your subject, and you won't regret it. It's really good. So next slide. So what can we actually do with our microscope once we've got it? Well, it certainly is jolly good for getting splinters out of your fingers, I can tell you that. Next slide. What a lot of beekeepers will do is to use it for looking for acarine. So this is set up for a thoracic dissection where you remove the head of the bee. Next slide, please. If you can get it off properly, what you see on the left-hand side is part of the trachea. But acarine mites enter the trachea through the little spiracle, which is right out on the edge, obviously, and is covered up at the moment by this little collar that you can see. So you have to remove that collar, which is easier said than done, and then you see the extremities of the trachea, and you can see if there are any mites there. Next slide, please. The other thing which I find fascinating is these anatomical dissections. So this is a bee set up, embedded in wax, and then there's liquid over the top. It's a mix of alcohol and water. It's just to support the delicate internal parts. If you just did it in air, they would destroy themselves in seconds. So you can float them out into the liquid quite easily. Next slide, please. So what you see when you remove the exoskeleton is the digestive system, all neatly packaged inside. Next slide. And if you're careful, you can tease it out and you can see the entire digestive system. And if you're studying anatomy, it's really fun to see exactly what's going on. It's different to the textbooks, and it's ever so hard to photograph properly a good anatomy slide. Okay, so next slide. So let's now look at the other type of microscope, the compounds. It's a bit more complicated, but not so difficult. This, unlike the previous one, which had reflected light, this microscope works on transmitted light. So on the foot of this microscope, you can see a little black circular lamp, which shines up through a focusing lens, a condensing lens, and passes through the slide. There's actually no slide on this particular microscope at the moment, but you can see where it should sit. The light then passes up into the objective lens and then up through to the eyepiece. And just the same as the other microscope, most of these microscopes will have a 10 times magnification eyepiece, and then there'll be a variety of eyepieces on a revolving turret, which you can see there in the picture. Next slide, please. So typically, a microscope will be supplied with a 4 times magnification, a 10 times, a 40 times, and a 100 times magnification. So if you multiply those by the 10 times eyepiece, what you're going to see with this microscope is 40 times, 100 times, 400 times, and 1,000 times magnification. And 1,000 is getting near to the limit of what a light microscope can resolve. We can can talk about that later if you're interested and if we have time.
Bob, can I just interrupt for one moment, please? I'm getting messages from people saying that they're not seeing what's happening full screen. Although we're seeing the full screen of your slides, the people tuning in aren't seeing it. They're just seeing the large picture of you, Bob. Is there anything that can be done about that, Rodri?
I'll just have a look now. Is that any better?
I will wait to see messages coming back. I think probably carry on for the moment, but
well, what I'll do in that case, we'll go belt and braces, and I'll see if I can put some equipment right up in front of the screen so that we can talk about it at the same time. So we've been talking about just this second this bigger compound microscope. We'll come back to it a bit later. I think to show you a few of the details, but on it there is a turret with a number of lenses which revolve around, and they are all the different magnifications, and they all have numbers on them which look a bit scary. None of them you really need to worry about, except the obvious ones that tell you what the magnification is. So you know, they'll say 10, 40, 60, whatever it may be. There are some lenses on these microscopes that work very close to the microscope slide, and there is a potential for a collision. That shouldn't happen in a well-adjusted microscope because there is a stop to stop that happening. But if there's something's not quite right, then they can come together. So the lenses that work nearest to the slides have a spring-loaded end to them, so that they don't do too much damage if they do collide.
Bob, just to let you know that people can now see the full screen.
Excellent. That's a relief, because everything's going everywhere here whilst I try and hold things up. Good. Okay. Now, one thing I can't do, I can't see you now. Good. Right.
We're currently on the objectives and the objectives lens slide.
Yes. Sorry. Let me just get rid of. Yes, there we are. Okay. All right. Sorry, everybody. We're now back on track. Good. Right. Okay. So you can see there are some numbers there. We'll talk about. Just go to the next slide, if you could, Roger, and then we can talk a little bit about what that actually means. So you can really, for general use, you can ignore most of this. The SP just means semi-plan. It's a type of lens, and you don't need to worry about it. The 10 and the 100 are the interesting bits. Those are the magnifications. The 0.25 and the 1.25, again, you don't need to worry about those. It's something called numerical aperture, and it's not necessary to even think about it tonight. 160 just means the light path length. It's 160 millimeters from one lens to the other. And you'll see there's a 0.17 and a dash. Now, the 0.17 refers to the thickness of the cover slip that you use on the slide. When you make a slide, you have a glass slide, you put the subject on, and then you protect it with a little glass cover slip, very thin. And if that cover slip's too thick, then there could be a collision. So 0.17 is just telling you that that needs to have a cover slip of that thickness and no bigger. The other lens on the left works much further away from the slide. It's not likely to come into contact, so it's not necessary to specify. And the only other thing that's interesting there, that the word oil appears on the right-hand side. Now that is what we call an oil immersion lens. You mustn't use oil on any of the other lenses or you'll damage them, but there is a particular specialist oil that has the same refractive index as the glass in the lens, or near enough. The problem at high magnification is that light gets split up into its component parts, and they all bend as they go from one medium to another, from glass to air, to a slightly different degree. But when you get to a very high magnification, if you've got an issue like that with the light bending, then that gives you a rather fuzzy image. So anything you can do to reduce the amount of time or the amount of times that the light refracts through different medium, the better. So you put a little drop of oil on the slide and very carefully lower this lens into the oil, and that has that effect. To be honest with you, there's not much that you really want to look at that magnification. It's academic, if you wish. The sort of things that you would need it for would be if you were looking at bacteria from, say, one of the foul broods, but most of us shouldn't really be messing around with foul brood bacteria anyway. I don't use mine. I can't remember when I last used it. So a very good tip I was given a long time ago is to park it in your microscope box for when you do need it and replace it with a 60 times lens. And that I do use a lot, and that's really, really very good. Okay, next slide, please. So focus, as you can see on this particular microscope, very simple. There's two differently geared knobs. The left-hand one gives you a pretty rapid movement, and the little knob that's sitting on top of it will give you your fine focusing adjustment. Next slide. So you also have a mechanical stage that gives you forward, back, and side to side, or if you want to get techie X and Y axis. And you can see on the stage there are two little micrometer measuring gauges. And the function of that is very simple. If you find something in the slide that you want to show to somebody at a later date, then you can write down the coordinates so that you can go to it very quickly and find it the next time round. Okay, next slide. So underneath the stage, there's a diaphragm which opens and closes like a camera lens does. So you can control the amount of light coming through, and using that, and most of these microscopes have a dimmer on the light. With the two together, that allows you to control the contrast of the picture that you're looking at. So next slide. There's also a little slide out filter holder, and you can put filters in there for various functions. Again, we can talk about that afterwards if you want to. A blue filter is often used for sharpening up an image. Next slide. So, like the dissecting microscope, you can get binocular versions of the compounds, but unlike the dissecting, this is not true stereo. You can see that there is only one lens, one objective lens. So that image is being split and passed up to both of the eyepieces. Now, that doesn't really matter, but the benefit of having a binocular compound is that if you're doing a lot of work, it can be a lot more relaxing to use than the single one optic microscope. The right-hand one has a device for attaching a camera, and that's great, but it's also something that you want to have a bit of advice on, because there are different microscopes working different ways, and you don't want to be caught out. There are some microscopes that will allow you to use the eyepieces or the camera, but not both. And that can be a bit of a nuisance. So it's quite nice not to have that. All these things are a factor of cost. I think, you know, it's cheaper to do it that way. Also, when you're attaching a camera, you're going to need to have a camera with live view on the screen. The reason for that is that if you focus your subject using the eyepieces, no microscope is going to be absolutely accurate, so that the focus through the eyepiece is the same as the camera is seeing. So what you really need to do is, if you're going to take a picture, is focus on the camera using the camera's live view screen rather than relying on the microscope's optics. Okay, next picture, please. Right, so let's see what we can do with this. Well, anatomy in much more detail. It's the microscope that you'd want if you were studying pollen. You'd use about a 400 times magnification for pollen. And next slide, please. The one that a lot of beekeepers will be familiar with is testing for nosema. So you sample of 30 bees, ground up, make a little temporary slide with some water and the soup from the bees, and you hope you don't see the picture on the right-hand side. So next slide, please. What we need to do is to be realistic about what we can and can't see. You won't see this sort of image. This is taken with an electron microscope, and that's really beyond most of us. They're very big. You have to operate in a vacuum. Your subject needs to be gold-plated, or at least sputter-plated with some form of metal for the electrons to recognize it. So they're not for the average person, but they are wonderful things, and there are books of amazing pictures that bees were taken with electron microscopes. The magnification is astounding. With some of them, you can get as high as 50 million times. It's quite extraordinary. Okay, next slide. So here's the unashamed plug. If you want to have a go, all the basic stuff is in this little book, which you can get from the Beecraft shop online. And it's a good opportunity for me to give a plug to our brand new website, which is brilliant, and the team have done a wonderful job putting it together. So you can access the shop through the website, where you can find that book and many others, and the little booklets that we talked about. So that's the slide presentation. So thanks, Roger. If we can remove that one, and perhaps we'll have a little chat about one or two things. Before we get right off subject, let me bring in a rather old microscope. This is a dissecting microscope, but it's one that I can take apart, and it gives me the opportunity to show you the rather complicated set of prisms inside it. Now, a standard image on a microscope, when it passes up to the eyepiece, is upside down and the wrong way around. Now, that happens in the big compound microscope that we've just seen, but if it was to happen in the dissecting microscope, you'd go crazy, because every time you moved your hands under the microscope to go in one direction, what would actually happen is you'd see the image going the other way. So you couldn't work that way. So this has a very clever set of prisms that converts the image so that what's going on the base is actually what you see at the top of the microscope. So that's quite a useful bit of kit just to demonstrate that, because the modern ones don't come apart like that. Have we any questions in so far, or shall we just press on?
No, we do indeed. We've got a few questions, actually. So, okay. Yeah.
Fire away.
Bit of a list to go through. So, Andrew Gibb has actually asked a question.
Hello, Andrew.
Would you recommend you buy a hand lens?
So why?
Where would you recommend to buy a hand lens?
You will find them on the internet easily, but there's quite a nice one which you can get. I think I've got one here. This is one from Brunel Microscopes, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's quite a nice size, and it's got a little light in it. I don't know if you can see that. So that illuminates the subject. So that's quite a neat bit of kit, and I'm not sure how much they are, but they're not a lot of money. Since we're on the subject, Brunel Microscopes is a company that I'm unashamedly plug a lot. They are very good to me and they look after me, but that's not the reason I'm plugging them, because when I was just starting out and they didn't know me from Adam, they were just the same. They were really helpful, really kind, and I have no doubt that if you go to them and ask for their advice and help, that they will give you the right advice and look after you. So that's kind of obviously other companies are available, but I would strongly recommend them. You can find them at brunelmicroscopes.co.uk, and if you ring them up, you'll get great advice. There's a bewildering amount of different types of microscope. You could get quite confused. So what Brunel have done is they, on their homepage, they've got an index which includes you'll find high-powered microscopes, the compounds and stereos, but there is a little section that's just aimed at beekeepers. I think it's called honeybee disease and insemination, or something along those lines. And that kind of focuses things down a bit, but you can look at that to get you started, and you can look at the bigger lists of microscopes and get a feel for what you think you might like, and then have a chat to them. I would say that they are very good at attending all the big shows. They've just been at the National Honey Show, they'll be at the Spring Convention, and it's quite good to go along and try things and just see what you like. What other questions have you got there?
They do produce a good set of microscopes actually for beekeepers, as you said. I've got a set on the wardrobe just above me by here actually, which is a compound and a stereo microscope combined. So,
yeah, they do a little deal. There's the one they recommend as a compound is it's a bit like this one. It's a fairly straightforward.
That's it. Similar to the one I've got, I think, actually.
SP27, I think it is. The only difference between that and this one is it's got a built-in camera which you can connect straight into a computer. But it's a good starting point. And the other thing that I think they put together and do a deal on is another form of dissecting microscope, and that's this rather unwieldy beastie here. I don't know if you can see that well enough, but it's called a long arm microscope for obvious reasons. And the advantage that has over the more conventional ones that we were looking at like this earlier is that there's a lot more room to move when you're doing dissections. This is fine, but you know, I did my beekeeping microscopy, British Beekeepers Association microscopy assessment on this microscope, so it works okay. But there's a lot more room with the long arm to work, so I thoroughly recommend it. And the other thing that it has with it, if I can hold it still long enough, it is quite heavy, is a gooseneck LED light, which is really an excellent piece of kit. I would still add in one of those other lights that I was talking about. I've got one here. This is IKEA's best, and it's just bendy light for a tenner. You can't go wrong. It's absolutely wonderful piece of kit. I think the deal at the moment is about. I wrote it down somewhere. I'm just trying to see if I can find it. Somewhere about just over £400 for the two. Does that sound right to you, Roderick, from when you bought yours?
It was a few years ago, so
Yeah.
I can't quite remember.
Right. Okay.
You mentioned photography earlier and camera fittings just then.
Yeah.
And Malcolm has asked a question actually about photography.
Yep.
So he said, is it practical to take photos using a normal microscope with no camera fitting, simply by removing the eyepiece and fitting a camera?
Well, I've seen people do it, and I've seen people do using camera. I've never had much luck with it, but I have seen people do it. One thing that people sometimes do is they'll take one of these and just put a mobile phone over it.
Do you know, I was just going to say that I did exactly the same thing on a microscopy course.
Yeah,
you've got to have a very steady hand, and but at least you've got that live view as well, so you can.
Exactly that. Yes. Yeah. Interestingly, another little toy that I've got here. These are just a few pounds, and they clip over your mobile phone like so, and they give you quite a big area. Just let me show you. Here's a. I don't know if you can see this. Can you read the text there? Can you see by my finger? It says times 100. Yeah. Okay, and there's a picture I took earlier of the same thing. So it's for a few quid you can have a bit of fun with that.
Yeah.
There are limitless toys. Here's a wonderful little gadget. This operates through your Wi-Fi system, and will send a live image to your mobile phone or your laptop. So there's there are so many toys out there. Talking of toys, I would counsel about being a little bit careful about being carried away. Let me talk about the Lidl effect. And any of you who know the bargain aisle in Lidl will know that it's not one that you can ignore. Now, that I got from Lidl about 3 or 4 years ago, probably longer. It connects just to a laptop. There's no eyepiece. You can't look through it. But it was 30 quid, and I couldn't resist it just to see what it was like. It has a zoom lens on it, which goes from 20 times up to 350 times. In theory, for that money, the optics are not great. But this is one I wanted to share with you, which is just. Let's see if I can do this. Can you see that? We can't hold it up much straighter, or everything will fall out. But you've got a compound microscope. There's a little camera to put on the top of it. There's a complete dissecting kit, and even some ready-made slides. That's another little special. A whole lot, $19.99, and it's ever so tempting. But they've got to make the savings somewhere, and they make the savings in the quality of the optics. So I don't know. It's a bit of fun, but I would be careful. I would rather put the money towards something else better. The other thing just to think about is with there are some very tempting things out there on eBay. But if you don't know what you're doing, it can be quite difficult. Not every objective lens matches every other microscope, and there could be some unseen damage. It's very difficult on the internet to know what you're getting. So if you have a go by all means, but I'm just saying go in with your eyes open and be careful.
No, that's great.
I have a question here.
Oh.
Yeah, somebody said picking up on linking it to your laptop.
Yeah.
Any real disadvantages in doing that? Where a USB connection to a laptop or desktop?
No, well, I mean, I'm no technical person, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that. But if I can manage it, anybody can. With any microscope, you will get the software to go with it to go onto your computer, so you can link it up. And usually, it'll allow you live view. And the opportunity to take photographs at the same time. So I don't think there are any downsides to it. It's good.
Thank you.
You get a better quality image if you use a proper camera. You know, with a proper camera, what you need is a funny sort of mount on the front of it that will fit into the tube on the top of the microscope. So that's called a T-mount, and you need to make sure that the mount you get is the right one for your particular camera. But any decent photographic supplier will be able to help you with that, and I'm sure Brunel would as well.
It's quite interesting taking photographs of pollen grains. I've experimented a few times with using the stain to colour them with that sort of pink colour, and then capture a few images.
Absolutely, yeah.
Not very successfully, but we've tried.
It's harder than it looks to get a good photograph of pollen. Yeah, and it's harder than it looks to make a good pollen slide. Actually, it's keeping the air bubbles and what have you, and dirt out is. I think scrupulous cleanliness is the answer with those things.
Well, speaking of cleanliness, that leads into a question. Actually, Graham Ashworth has asked this question. How do you clean your slides, especially cover slips? They always seem dirty, especially when new, or even when new.
Well, there is a lens cleaning liquid called ROR, which I might even have somewhere. And you're going to ask me what ROR stands for now, aren't you? Residual oil remover. There you go. Which you can get from, what dare I say it, Brunel microscopes. But I'm sure you can get it on the internet. Anyway, so that's pretty good. And just the sort of tissues that you would use if you were cleaning a camera lens would be fine. It's not a bad idea to do that from time to time with the lenses on your microscope as well.
Oh, okay.
I
remember somebody saying you can use isopropyl alcohol to clean the lens as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that would work. Yes, it's that would be okay. I mean, it's an alcohol. It's, you know, you could do it with vodka if you wanted to, but I can think of better uses for that. Okay, any other questions?
You got any questions, Stephen? Something I wanted to ask, which I'm quite keen to do myself, is the microscopy examinations.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, what's the process for that with the BBKA or the WBKA? What does the syllabus cover really?
Okay. Well, it's pretty broad brush. So there are 7 different aspects to the assessment. It usually it's either a morning or an afternoon's worth. Some people are quicker than others, but 2 to 3 hours. So you have to explain in some detail exactly how each of your microscopes works, so the principles of light microscopy. You'd be asked to do a dissection for acarine, so a tracheal dissection, which under exam conditions and your hands are shaking, that's not an easy thing to get right, but people do. It's just practice. You'd be asked to do an abdominal dissection to reveal the digestive system of the bee, and you'd be asked to explain what all the component parts are and what they do. So a bit of anatomy knowledge would be necessary. You were asked to prepare a set of 6 pollen slides from a list that is given to you. I think there's about a dozen or 14 different pollens that go across an entire year. So you'd need to be preparing you know, if you were going to do it next autumn, we run them in October, the assessments. You'd need to be starting in sort of January with Willow and moving on from there. What else are we going to ask you? There would be, you'd have to do a nosema test, as we just discussed earlier, and you'd have to understand about sampling and why and how you go about it. You'd be asked to make 4 anatomy slides as well. They're tougher things to do, and some are easier than others. So the BBKA have been a bit fiendish, and they have 4 different groups, and you have to poem one from each of the groups in order to satisfy them. So you can't just get away with all the easy ones. And then you'd be asked about general brood diseases, just a general health things that you need to understand, you know, the signs of AFB and EFB and all the other various diseases that bees are susceptible to. So that's basically it. I think you need to have your basic assessment before you can apply for it, but I don't think you need any other qualifications. And to my mind, it's actually the most fun of all the. If an exam can be fun, doing the written modules, it's great, but it can be a bit stressful. But the microscopy is a good thing. It's not regimented. We don't say you've got to start at a certain time, and if you haven't finished in 2 hours, you're out. It's pretty flexible. So yeah, I recommend having a go.
I have a question here about courses, and someone wants to know about just casual courses. They don't want to do the exams. Are they easy to find?
Not so easy. Sometimes your local associations will run them. Mine does from time to time, but not on a regular basis. There's a really good, if you go onto the NDB website and look for NDB short courses, they are superb. They do them in different parts of the country. And if you can find a microscopy one, which they usually run at least one a year, I'd strongly recommend that, and it's worth travelling. I did one many years ago down in Devon with Ken and Dan Basterfield, and it was terrific. There's sometimes they run one at Dedham Vale, in Constable Country. There's a wildlife field, I can't remember what its title is now, Field Research Centre or something similar. But if you Google Devon, you'll find it.
And for those who don't know, NDB?
The National Diploma of Beekeeping. But I think you probably get there just putting the initials in. Sorry, I should have said. Yeah. But apart from that, looking around for local ones, if you're anywhere near Harrogate, if you're lucky to live near there, seek out a gentleman called John Chandler. Gosh, if I lived near there, I'd be on his courses. He's brilliant. So if you're in that neck of the woods, find him.
I've seen you introducing microscopy to the International Meeting of Young Beekeepers.
Oh, yes.
How did that go?
Really well. It was a few of them had a little bit of experience of microscopes, but most of them had none at all. So we got them all to make a nosema slide. And the way we worked it was that I made one to show them what was necessary, and I showed them what they were going to have to look for, and then packed them off to have a go. And they were brilliant, really, really good at it. Yeah, they were a great crowd. It was a lovely occasion.
I think there's always a bit of fear surrounding microscopes. That's the impression I get. People tend to be scared of them.
Well, I think, yes, it's because of all this technical stuff. We touched on refractive indices and birefringence and chromatic aberrations, and that's where people kind of zone out. So, as I said earlier, you don't need to know all that stuff to drive the thing. If you want to learn about it, that's fine, and it can come later. But it isn't really desperately necessary. Whilst we're talking about techie stuff, we might just talk about magnification sizes a bit. I think that's quite interesting without getting too scientific, because we work in very small measurements here. We're talking in light rays of nanometers. Now, I can't conceive of a nanometer because it's a billionth of a meter. But what does bring it home, I think, is if you think, well, we can all imagine a millimeter. And if you divide a millimeter into 1,000 little sections, that's a micron. And if you divide a micron into 1,000 little sections, that's a nanometer. So it's really, really tiny. And without, again, getting too techie, the light that we see, white light, is comprised of various different wavelengths that go from about 800 nanometers for red light to about 400 nanometers for blue light. So again, I'm just trusting this information. I'm not a scientist to explain the science behind this, but a microscope can resolve an image up to half of the wavelength of light. So if you put that blue filter into your microscope, you're using monochromatic light at 400 nanometers. So half of that is 200 nanometers. So if you go back to what I said about there being 1,000 nanometers in a micron, we can resolve about half a micron is about the smallest that you can get. So what does that mean in reality? Well, pollen grains range from 6 microns for tiny ones. Most of them are 25 to 50 microns, and some of the bigger ones are up around the 100 micron mark. Human hair is about 75 microns thick. Nosema, 5 to 8 microns. But then if you get down to the really small stuff, viruses are really tiny, so they're sort of 6 to 400 nanometers. So you're only going to see the very largest of those with a light microscope. So that's where you need to get to the electron one. And interestingly, a strand of human DNA, I'm told, is about 2.5 nanometers. So there you go. So,
it is a very complicated topic.
Well, it can be. It doesn't have to be. You don't need to know any of that at all. It's just kind of, it can be quite interesting. One of the things on the kit front too, whilst I think of it, is that if you want to dip a toe in the water and you buy a basic microscope and then you think, wow, this is terrific, I really want to do more, then there's no reason why you can't part exchange that microscope for a better one, and you'll get really good deals. I'll say it again, good old Brunel, they'll do a good deal on that sort of thing.
I think quite a few associations now have started purchasing microscopes as well and hiring them out to members to do Nosema testing. So
absolutely,
it's always worth speaking to your local association as well.
It certainly is, yes. And there are certain things that even if you have got your own microscopes, there are certain things that the association could buy for joint use. For example, you can put a measuring eyepiece graticule into the top of your eyepiece, and that's a scale, but it isn't actually a proper measurement because, of course, you've got 4 different types of magnification. So what you do is you have a little gadget. It's a slide with a very accurate measurement printed onto it, and you compare your gauge in the eyepiece with it's called a stage micrometer. And you can work out a series of numbers. So what I held up earlier is that this little bit of paper with all the numbers on it. I've worked out for my microscope what each lens produces in terms of an exact measurement for one little section of the eyepiece graticule. Once you've done that once, you never need to do it again. So that's a perfect thing for an association to buy. Also,
computer software as well, where you can, if you've got a live stream where you plug your microscope into your laptop, you can actually measure on the fly. So once you've done that graticular measurement, the conversion, you can get the sort of real-time measurement then as well.
I've never used one, but I believe you can. Yeah, absolutely. Now you're pushing the limits of my tech. I'm very low tech. I like to take things apart and look at them.
Have you got any questions, Stephen? Anything?
No, nothing more from me, thanks. Except I would like to ask Bob,
yeah,
what's the most startling thing that you've seen in your microscopy with bees?
Oh my goodness. Well, I don't know if it's startling, but I think when I first started doing dissections and started to open up a bee and see what really goes on inside, it is amazing. This little, incredibly complex creature. That never ceases to amaze me. I suppose that's probably what I would pick. It's a real eye-opener when you've only seen it in books to actually see it. And that's what a ventriculus is, and there's the gut, and there are rectal pads, and
and there's a brain the size of a sesame seed.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting. Yeah. There's some books that we probably should recommend to people. Apart from the obvious one, which of course you're all going to rush out and buy, the real good ones for dissection is a book by Dade. It's called Anatomy and Dissection of the Honeybee. That's really an excellent book. And along with that, that you can get from the International Bee Research Association, which you can Google. And in the back of it are some really good diagrams, and IBRA have produced those on A4 sheets, which are laminated, so you can have them beside you on the bench when you're mucking around. And they are super. So I'd thoroughly recommend those. And then in terms of pollen, Rex Sawyer's written a classic book, Pollen Identification for Beekeepers, and he has a very good one as well on honey, so analysis of that. So that's a good book to have. And another one that I thoroughly commend to you, but I was trying earlier and I couldn't see it on the IBRA website. If you can find one of these, this is by Dorothy Hodges, and she was an artist, and she made the most beautiful drawings of pollen, and they're really nice. So it's called The Pollen Grain Drawings of Dorothy Hodges, and it's just a little paperback. It's not a very expensive one. It's from a book that is incredibly expensive. If you ever see one of these in a secondhand bookshop, grab it. The Pollen Loads of the Honeybee by Dorothy Hodges. It has her drawings in it in the same way, but what it's got in the back, this is a first edition, and for the first edition she produced sheets of color to represent pollen colors very accurately, cut them up into cubes. Each one of those is stuck in by hand, and there are pages of them. Can you imagine how long it took to produce that book? I
think it was Richard was showing us his copy a couple of events ago, wasn't he? He managed to obtain a copy.
Did
he? Yeah.
Well, the second edition they gave up, and they didn't bother. The other curio that's out there, if you can ever find one, goes with the old the Rex Sawyer book on pollen. He produced a whole series of punch cards. You won't really be able to see this clearly, but they're just like the old computer punch cards. And when you're analyzing pollen, you've got all these different categories like size, shape, aperture numbers, and so on and so forth. And there is a sheet in here for each of those. So if you decide, for example, that your pollen size is small, you pick up the one with small apertures, and you go through and you put all the ones that you think have the characteristics together, and then you hold them up to the light. And if it's worked, there'll be one hole left next to a number, and you can look the number up in his book. Does it work?
We'll need to invent computers one day.
Yeah, oh, you can already. You do it on computer, but as I've just said, you know, low tech me, I like that.
Yeah, I think we've come to an end for this evening's event. Anyway, thank you very much, Bob. That was interesting. It's good to get an idea of what microscopes can do, and I think that's what we wanted to achieve with this event. And then perhaps sometime next year, now we can have you back and explore some of the detail a little more if you're interested.
A pleasure.
Brilliant. Excellent.
Okay.
I'd like to apologize as well for the technical difficulties this evening. As I said, we've got a new website on the go. Feel free to explore that as well, and any comments, come back to us. But, thank you very much for listening in, and we'll see you next month. So,
good night.
from me.
Good night.
Good night.